They are so common, ubiquitous, and work so well that you don't even notice them at all. And that's a beautiful thing. But what you may not know is that screws are used in many, many more ways than just to fasten things together. If screws just suddenly disappeared, you'd have way more problems with things just falling apart. I don't want to spoil the fun, but over the next few videos I'm making about screws, I think you'll see that humble helix is amazingly important and profound in ways you probably never imagined, and affects you more than you know. The first kind of screw we know of wasn't anything like you would usually think of. Instead, it was used to move water. Probably first used in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon around 600 BC, which was likely in Nineveh in modern Iraq. Today we know it as Archimedes' screw. Archimedes was the first to describe them in writing when we saw them in Egypt around 234 BC. The ancient Egyptians living along the Nile were making so much food with irrigation by several techniques, including water screws like these, making Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. While primarily used to convey water throughout the ages, as it still is sometimes today, the water screw is beneficial, if not critical, for other uses, like in plastic injection molding, snow blowers, chocolate fountains, or if you have one of these in your combine harvester, you're looking at an idea well over 2,000 years old, and a better way hasn't yet been found. But how else were screws used in the ancient world? Ancient people who wanted wine or olive oil had a big problem. It's a real pain to crush the fruits to extract the juices in a maximally profitable way. We know what wine was used for, but everyone around the Mediterranean used tons of olive oil too, and it was a huge business. One of the earliest known ways to extract it, other than the good old feet method, was to make a press. There were many variations on the fruit press in the ancient world, but what it really came down to was a few basic designs that used a huge beam that was pulled down to squish the fruit. Now, to you, this idea may seem impossibly out of fashion by a few thousand years, but if you're like me, you probably have one of these fruit presses in your kitchen too. This is just a mini version of an idea thousands of years old, and one of the first and most important simple machines ever made. Eventually, someone made a huge leap by using a screw vertically through the end of the beam and anchoring it with a giant rock. Now you could use coal to turn the screws, which tried to pick up the rock, but really had the practical effect of bringing the lever down. But then there was another leap, in a new, different press, which would eventually have an incredibly profound impact, far, far beyond fruit pressing. This new press got rid of almost everything and put the screw right on top of the fruit pressing on boards. This press had the advantage of being small, easier and cheaper to build, and still highly effective. Now a single person can easily pull a lever and exert a tremendous amount of force downwards on a simple, cheap machine that's also very productive. Or, alternately, you could make a larger version and employ a few people or animals to press a lot of fruit really profitably, and they were used until relatively modern times. But the importance of this style of press doesn't end with olive oil and wine. Oh no, it's way more important than that. In the next episode in this series, you'll see how this simple style of press and the pattern of this machine is something of a ticking time bomb. When combined with a few other inventions, roughly 1,500 years later, it would help kick off a chain reaction that would impact millions of people, were some of the best, but also some of the most horrible things that will happen in Western civilization really start to unfold, and which we're still dealing with today. But we're going to save that for next time. Remember Archimedes, the guy who was the first to describe the water screw earlier? He's probably the inventor of a completely different way to use a screw, and something we generally now call a worm drive. This simple but clever device combines a screw acting as a special gear, and the worm wheel, which is a gear of only slightly different form. The brilliance of this cannot be understated, as it allows for a great conversion of rotational distance to torque in a very compact and elegant way, while also turning the direction of travel 90 degrees. It takes one full turn of the endless screw to advance one tooth of the worm wheel. This has a great advantage of a massive reduction by however many teeth you have in your gear to one. With this idea, and a few other tricks like the compound pulleys he also invented, Archimedes, also famous for designing war machines, probably used worm drives in lifting devices like his iron claw that allegedly pulled Roman ships partially out of the water, capsizing them. His lifting mechanism reputedly takes advantage of another important property of a worm drive, in that you can't easily drive it backwards, meaning rotation through the worm wheel won't spin the endless screw. This was possibly used to great advantage in lifting mechanisms, as it meant the crank you turn wouldn't have to be held in place to keep it from spinning backwards, possibly injuring the crew. So, we have external threads pretty well figured out, but what about internal ones? Someone else who built upon Archimedes' work on screws is a man usually known as Hero. Around the 1st century, a highly inventive Greek living in Roman Egypt in the city of Alexandria, he invented many things that we'll have to talk about another day. While it's easy enough to make decent external threads, making internal threads, like you'd find on a nut, is very tricky indeed. So he decided to invent a kind of boring machine to duplicate external threads into internal ones. First, he started with a block of wood with a hole bored in it. Then from the outside, he inserted some sharpened dowels that matched the pitch of the thread. This was a brilliant way to make internal threads without actually making internal threads. From there, it was easy to make an external threaded screw chiseled out the usual way. And then, onto that, he added an extension. Into the extension near the end, he put a metal cutter that he could raise up and down for pass. Then he placed another piece of wood with a hole bored in it in front of this. And then over several passes, and much more slowly than this of course, raised the cutter bit by bit and slowly bored out the workpiece. And by this method, he could make internal threads without starting with internal threads. With this internal thread cutting machine, look what's really happening here. This is a very early instance of a mechanism which is removing the skill of the operator from the equation and putting it into the machine. It takes a skilled person to cut the first master thread, but after that, with only a little training, someone else could run a machine like this and make a beautiful complex part, an internal thread, and do it again and again with high repeatability. And this is the basis for our mass-produced industrial world, putting the skill into mechanized machines that would just feed raw material and power. Remember the pattern of this particular machine. We're going to see it again. Hero used his relatively high-quality screws and gears in a number of ways, and one of them was in something called the dioptra, which was a high-quality surveying instrument driven by worm drives on 2 axes. I have an antique telescope mount that works in exactly the same way, though only on 1 axis. This is literally the same mechanics as a device about 2,000 years old. Like mine, Hero's dioptra presumably had a scale on it as well, so you could understand how much you moved as you turned the screws. Doesn't that make it some form of early micrometer? So what about the small metal screws we're so familiar with? Where were they first used? We have to jump ahead to the late medieval period to Germany in the late 1400s. The Germans of this period had very advanced mining, metalworking technology, and highly skilled artisans. It was probably here that metal screws and bolts were first semi-regularly used as fasteners, showing up in 15th century German plate armor as one example. So hey, real talk. I have to step aside here and discuss an important topic. There will be exceptions, but very broadly speaking, the difference between a screw or a bolt is a bolt goes through something unthreaded and has a nut or something else threaded on the other side. A screw is put into something usually unthreaded and makes its own thread as it goes in. And of course, there's all kinds of things called screws or bolts that aren't fasteners at all. Please argue about this in the comments, and show your counterexamples, as it is tradition, whenever someone brings up screw versus bolt. Going forward, I will use screw to mean screw or bolt, and let you figure it out. Okay, back to armor. Screws are more likely to be found in high-quality tournament armor, rather than the field armor worn by the lower ranks. Typically, rivets or other kinds of fasteners were used in most places, and screws only were truly needed. We actually don't know much about thread making in these times. Sometimes the screws were just driven through the armor plate in a self-tapping manner, usually into areas which had been thickened so it would have greater bite for the threads. So, if you have screws, you have a screwdriver, right? Actually, no. Because screws were so uncommon at this point, why bother to make a dedicated tool? Plus, a screwdriver is such a simple device. They were just added onto the ends of handles on other tools. While you might think your multi-tool is a new idea, it's actually been around for many hundreds of years. Also from around this time, there is a remarkable German document from around the 1480s. often referred to as the medieval housebook, something of a how-to manual for lords and knights. But it's also proudly showing many of the wonderful drawings of machines, processes, and devices, often with the new crazy technology, the screw. Although we can't see the screws, it does show the kinds of armor that would have had them. And in the other drawing, screws start popping up everywhere. One remarkable example is screws being used to regulate the angle of cannons. Much like Hero used screws for precision adjustments in his diopter, now screws are being used to angle cannons on two axes. I've not been able to find any other illustrations of cannons ever actually being made like this, so if someone has a reference, I'd love to know more about it. And while we'll talk about this in more detail in a bit, screws take a bit of an ominous turn, showing up in various tools you keep in your dungeon. What's especially remarkable is they bother to draw a small screw that appears to be slotted, which tells you it's important to them. This implies a screwdriver, but one is never shown. Also, this drawing clearly shows a wrench to be used to turn nuts, both square and hexagonal on the torture instruments. And then, out of nowhere it seems, like a spaceship coming down from the sky. No, not the guys in ridiculously pointy shoes showing some of the ways to assault a tower. But on the other side of the page, where a surprisingly complex screw-cutting lathe is shown. The lathe is shown in two parts. The first is the frame, which includes the master screw and the workpiece to be cut, here with some threads already cut in it. And then below it, the cutting part of the lathe is removed so we can see it more clearly. It fits into the frame of the lathe in the slot under the master screw in the workpiece, held in place by a wedge. And look what a giant leap this is. Not only do we have a removable cutter, a tool bit like is still used in lathes today, but also a cross slide regulated by an internal screw. Remember a Hero's machine for cutting internal threads? Well, this is a highly refined version of the same idea, but for copying external threads with a bunch of modern stuff thrown in. Imagine how when you turned the crank, the master screw would push the workpiece forward past the cutting tool, copy